tour on my background.
Perfect. And you can, if you're able to share your screen, and then we can roll.
Yeah, and I just want to add this. So I closed a couple of articles. I really don't want to go over the articles. Those are just references for you. I'm going to give you a brief presentation, just my thought process. I'm doing this 40 years. Just have it, excuse me, just have a discussion. There's no right or wrong answers. So just want to briefly, let's see if I could find this here. Where am I here? Oh, God. Why do I not have my desktop on this? Where would I find that, Chris?
Are you in full screen with Zoom?
I am in full screen, and I have. I'm just looking for my desktop. See.
Press maybe the escape button, or if you minimize the screen, it should pop up the rest of your desktop.
Okay. Hold on. Let's see. Let's see. Let's go. When it comes to IT with me, Chris, I stands for idiot. So. Yeah, I've done this before, but it's not coming up. And why is that?
If it makes it easier, if you want, you could email me the slides and I could share my screen.
I got it.
Worst case scenario.
Okay, I've got the talk up. Now what do I do?
So there should be on the bottom, it should say share screen, the green button. Do you see that?
Yeah, I hit that. And I don't know why it's not. Oh boy. There we go. So. Do you want me to email this to you?
Yep, if that makes it easier for you, I can open it up real quick.
Let me just try to do that.
Sure.
I'm going to send it to you on my private email.
Okay.
Chris, what's your email?
Let's make it easy. We'll do Chris, Hughen, my last name.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Hughen.
Okay.
The letter 1.
Okay.
At gmail.com.
Should have it.
Okay, let me check.
Why am I not?
Okay, perfect. I'll pull it up.
Hold on a second. Chris, let me log out and log back in.
Okay. Oh. Sorry, buddy. Brief technical. Rob said he's not ideal at technology.
If he could have just shared his screen, we could have told him how to share his screen.
I got his email, so we'll just wait for him to come back in. There we go. Okay, you're back. All right, Rob, I'll share my screen and you can just lead from here. Does this work for you, Rob? You're muted. You there, Rob? You're muted.
You good?
Oh, we're good. Sweet.
I don't know if you
Okay.
want to make that full screen or is
Sure.
that? All right. So again, I just want to have a conversation, just my philosophy, just how we look at rehabilitating athletes and how we train athletes. So go to the next slide, Chris, please. So I want to thank Chris and Quentin, and obviously all of you for your interest in what I have to say today. You could be doing other things that I'm sure you might probably be better off with, but again, I just want to thank you. So next slide. So we'll talk about training again and return to play. And this is our process. Like I said, we look at how do we rehab athletes and how do we go through a rehab program design with regards to our thought process. So next slide. When you rehab an athlete, or when you're going to train an athlete, but we'll stick mostly with rehab based on the population, based on the audience we have today. You have to figure out, how am I going to get my athlete in rehab to go from low velocity activities to high velocity activities, right? And even the 75-year-old who's a total knee replacement, but is a golfer, they need high velocity on their swing, though they may not be sprinting. So athletics, requires high velocity movement. And then your planning progression, you have to think, how am I going to get there when someone's either in a sling after shoulder surgery, or if they're on crutches after knee or hip or ankle surgery. Next slide. The other thing you have to consider when you work with athletes is this. We look at things called limb symmetry indexes, right? We compare one limb to the other. And I'll get into this a little bit more later on. And that's fine, and that's valid, right? But the non-affected limb hasn't been doing a lot either in the early stages of post-op rehab. So it's becoming deconditioned. And so one thing you need to look at is that the standards of the game, right? Because every day in practice, your athlete that you're rehabbing is going to be meeting their peers on the practice field that meet the standards of the game. And in competition, they're going to meet the opposition that meets the standards of the game. And game day, there's nothing that we can replicate, never mind practice, game day with the adrenaline and everything else that's going on. So here's a study by 1991 looking at Division I, Division II, and Division III football players. And if you look at these exercises, you'll see that makes sense, right? Division II exercises are stronger and more powerful than Division III. And Division I athletes are stronger and more powerful than Division II and Division III athletes. And back in 91, the average Division I football player, could squat 424 pounds. So if you have an ACL reconstruction and they're going to return to play, if that's the standard of the game, can they meet that standard, even though their LSI may be 100%? Now that's 91. You have the next slide. So this is 2006, 15 years later. If you want to be in the 90th percentile of a Division I football player, you have to be able to squat 500 pounds with an N of almost 1,200 players being reviewed. Can your ACL reconstructed athlete squat 500 pounds? If you look at the high school athlete, if you want your high school athlete to be recruited, if they're supposed to be in the 90th percentile, they have to be able to squat 465 pounds. Even if they're in the 50th percentile, they have to squat almost 350 pounds. Can your high school athlete do that, regardless of what their LSI is? So the LSIs are important, but you also have to look at the standards of the game. And not everybody has to squat 500 pounds. Gymnasts don't, golfers don't, fencers don't. But what is the standards of their game? Next slide, please. Same thing for sprint times. If you have a high school athlete that's running a 5.3 4-yard dash, they're not getting away from anybody and they're not catching anybody. And so, again, the standards of the game. If you think of a Major League Baseball pitcher, they can have LSIs of 100%, right? Full range of motion, strength is good, no pain. But if a Major League Baseball pitcher only has a 70-mile-an-hour fastball, they're not going to be playing in a Major League Baseball game because they haven't met the standards of the game. And when they get to 90 miles an hour, then maybe they'll play, even though the LSIs were equal or 90% or 95% or better. Next slide, please. So here's something we look at when we test our athletes for return to play. This is an ACL. These are 3 males. One's an offensive lineman, one's a running back, and one's a linebacker. And you can see their month post-op. And if you look at vertical jumps, and vertical jumps are a very good test of athleticism. And the big difference between athleticism and skill, and that's a conversation for another day. But if you look at their bilateral jumps, you'll see they're 28, 30, and 22 inches respectively. If you look at their brown column next to them, you'll see what their single leg ACL vertical jump is. And when you compare that jump to their non-operative jump, you'll see they're 98, 90, and 110% LSI. So the linebacker, the gentleman, his column at the bottom, excuse me, he has 110% LSI, meaning his ACL limb is better than his non-op limb. But with a 22-inch vertical jump, you'll see he's in like the 10th percentile. So when it comes to, and these are, I just want to adjust something, I'm sorry. He's in the 10th percentile of his peers if he went to the NFL Combine. The offensive lineman has a 28-inch vertical jump. He's 98% his LSI, but he's only in the 45th percentile of his peers for vertical jump. So don't forget, LSI is important, but that's where you start. Don't forget the standards of the game, because that's what they're meeting in practice every day, and that's what they're meeting on the field of play, every competition. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about this as well. If you look at the parts on these machines, right, a 1953 Corvette Stingray versus a 2021 Corvette, have the parts on those machines changed? And yes, they have, right? Engines, technology, transmissions, et cetera. And you could say the same thing from a 1980 Mac to a 2021 present day Mac. Technology, ease of operation, everything's much improved. Next slide, please. But if the parts on Bill Russell, who was a great basketball player from 1950, is his parts any different than LeBron James's? Does he have 2 hearts? Does LeBron James have 2 hearts, 5 thigh muscles, 4 brains? Or is the human body basically the same for the present, for decades and probably centuries? Not our training techniques, not our knowledge of what to do. I'm just talking about the physical anatomy and physiology of the body. Has it changed? And the answer is no. Next slide, please. So if the parts of the human body, the anatomy, the neuromuscular system, the physiology, if they haven't changed, then should the basic philosophical training principles really differ? Really, has it vastly changed over the years? And I'm not speaking about what you see on the internet and the newest and slickest exercise. I'm talking about principles of overload and how to plan programs, et cetera. They really haven't changed that much. Nothing's really new. It's been renamed. I have a friend of mine named Bilateral who says, you tell me the exercise and I'll tell you what we used to call it. And that's very true. Next slide, please. So what I've been taught by my mentors is that the fastest running, highest jumping, highest throwing velocity, highest bat or golf club speed, et cetera, are the athletes who put the most force into the ground in the shortest period of time. I really believe it's that simple. What's difficult? How do we get someone acutely in the rehab phase at low velocity to be able to do that at high velocity? That's what's difficult. Next slide, please. So if you look at the research, you'll see if we look at sprinters, Weiland has shown that speed is conferred predominantly by the ability to put force into the ground surface area. Where Ralph Mann, who's done a tremendous amount of research on sprinting, says the fastest athletes spend the least time on the ground. Most force into the ground in the shortest period of time. Next slide, please. So if you look at coming out of the blocks, right? When you come out of the blocks, you have a high ground contact time because you're traveling at low velocity. And as your linear velocity increases, your ground contact time decreases, right? Again, I'll say this time and again, force into the ground in the shortest period of time. Next slide. The other thing our athletes have to be able to do, especially with lower extremity surgeries, is that they have to be able to tolerate the ground reaction forces, right? Newton's law, equal and opposite reaction. So if you look at world-class sprinters, they put up to 5 times body weight into the ground at a ground contact time of less than 100 milliseconds. Can they sustain or can they resist or tolerate the reaction force by putting that much force into the ground? And if they can't, then they're not going to put high levels of force into the ground. It's kind of like the analogy of a car. A car's not going to drive 100 miles an hour. If you're not going to drive a car at 100 miles an hour if the brakes can't stop it from 100 miles an hour. Even in marathon runners, what's the tolerance for ground reaction forces? 3 times body weight for 25,000 ground impacts. Can your athlete tolerate, not only have the ability to apply those forces into the ground, but tolerate those reactive forces 25,000 times? How do you prepare your athlete to do that? That's part of the rehab process. Next slide, please. So again, as I told you, working the offseason of the New York Giants, I've gotten to know Coach Parcells a little bit, and I think he's a very wise man. And in rehab, we know the problems with kinesiophobia, right? We know that many athletes don't return to their previous level of play because of the fear to apply and accept force. And whether you're looking at kinesiophobia or you're testing an athlete or you're rehabbing an athlete or you're looking at athletic performance, our athletes have to have and reestablish the confidence to put force into the ground and accept those reactive forces. And there's only one way they're going to have confidence, and that's at a demonstrated ability. All of you will sit and take your board exams, right? You'll either pass your exams or you won't. I'm sure you will pass them. But you're not just giving your license because people think you'll be a good therapist. You have to have the demonstrated ability to pass your boards to then become a licensed physical therapist. It's the same with your athletes going through rehab. They have to demonstrate the ability to apply force through a progression. Otherwise, you can't assume that they will. And they have to demonstrate the ability to tolerate force, deceleration, change of direction, etc. You can't assume that they're going to be able to do that. And so again, they have to demonstrate that ability, and you have to establish a process for them of loading and accepting loads so that they gain that confidence. Next slide, please. So here's our philosophy. Our philosophy, we use something called Vermeil's hierarchy athletic development, and we modified it in rehabilitation. Those are a couple of the articles I sent to you. Next slide, please. Now, Al Vermeil is a good friend and a mentor, and Al Vermeil is a 6-time world champion strength and conditioning coach, 7-time. He's the only strength and conditioning coach that has won a Super Bowl and 6 NBA championships, and he's just a brilliant man. And so we took his hierarchy and we adapted it for rehab. And essentially, the adaptation in rehab is based on 2 guiding principles. The healing continuum of the body, right? Because we don't want to overstress something that's going through a healing process and disrupt that healing process, because not only the patient be upset with you, but so will the surgeon who did the surgery. And then to correlate the physical qualities we're going to develop or enhance at appropriate times of the healing continuum. So next slide, please. So let's talk about the healing continuum. And I'm not going to go over the healing continuum with you, because that's something you should know. And if you don't know, learn it, because it's important. Next slide. One thing is this: you can't rush the process when it comes to biology. You may have great aspirations that your athlete is presenting admirably with the tasks you're giving them, but be careful not to cross the line, even though they look good, because you can't rush biology. We know that there's certain periods of time that athletes heal, and what heals at certain periods of time. And the only time we turn the clock ahead is once a year for an hour. So you can't rush biology. Respect the process of healing. Next slide. So we know the healing continuum, healing occurs at predictable time intervals, right? There's the unlucky folks. They didn't pick their parents well, or they had an infection post-op, or they took a fall, or they didn't adhere to your instructions, right? And they did something stupid, I'll use that term, and they disrupted their surgery, or they injured themselves. Then there's the lucky folks, right? The old saying, great Olympic athletes pick their parents well. They have great genetics. They listen to you. They did their home exercise program. You have the Adrian Petersons of the world, but they're the exception. We know most people are going to fall right in the middle of that bell-shaped curve. And that's why we know we can predict healing overall to the general population. Next slide, please. So you know you have 3 stages, and this is all finished with the healing continuum. You have your reaction stage, regeneration repair stage, and your remodeling stage. All right, and you guys can look into these things, but know this, that obviously different things occur at each stage. And remember, when an athlete has surgery, there's 2 traumas. There's the trauma of the initial injury, and there's a trauma from the invasive procedure of surgery. And they have to heal from both traumas. Next slide. So there'll be a point in time with your rehab, and I get it. Tommy John surgery is different than an ankle sprain. But there'll be a time in the rehab process, if the athlete stays with you long enough, based on restrictions of their insurance provider, or if they want to pay cash, or whatever it may be, you'll see as you get into practice that the diagnosis, when you get to the remodeling stage, is not as significant as it was earlier in the rehab process. Healed is healed, right? It's less about a rotator cuff versus a labral repair. Healed is healed. It's less about ACL graft choice, hamstring, quad tendon, central third patella tendon. There are nuances that you have to pay attention to, don't get me wrong, but healed is healed, right? And so there's a point in time you rehab, it's more about enhancing physical qualities than the concern of disruption of surgery. Because if they're healed, then you're dressed with a deconditioned athlete that may have some contraindications, and you should be aware of those contraindications not to exacerbate their condition. But your job, if they're with you long enough through this process, is to reestablish these physical qualities, so that when they go back to their training, they go back to return to play, or they go back to actual game day competition or practice, they're able to tolerate the ability of reactive forces as well as apply force. Next slide. So then we'll talk about the physical qualities. Next slide. So again, as Coach Vermeil, he won 6 world championships with the Chicago Bulls. He'll tell you he had a little bit of help by a guy named Michael Jordan. And he won a Super Bowl, and he'll tell you he had a little help with a guy named Joe Montana. But Al's very humble, but he's a brilliant man. So if you look at Vermeil's hierarchy of athletic development, what's important to note is that each physical quality is dependent upon the optimal development of its predecessor. Next slide, and we'll go into this. So if you look at a 100-meter dash, all right, I'm big with analogies, so I think it makes things easier to understand. When you come out of the blocks from a dead stop, That start is due to the application of applied strength, right? A mechanical application of strength, muscle force. And you have a high ground contact time and you emit a certain amount of force. And then as you accelerate, strength with velocity is power. We know that, right? We call it explosive strength. And what happens? Your ground contact times start to go down and force application goes up. Then there'll be a point in the sprint where instead of you applying a mechanical conscious effort of force, you're actually rebounding from the ground. And that's plyometric, right? We call that elastic and reactive strength. And then eventually you'll hit top speed in the standing upright position of elastic reactive strength to top speed. And you're at the lowest ground contact times and the highest velocities. Go back, please. Let's look at this in reverse. How could you possibly hit optimal top speed unless you're optimally elastic and reactive? And how can you be optimally elastic and reactive unless you're optimally powerful or have optimal levels of explosive strength? And how could you have optimal levels of explosive strength if you don't have optimum levels of strength? And that's the hierarchy. Next slide, please. The other thing is that you need load, all right? You need to recruit the 2x motor fibers. You need to apply load. It's not a factor of low loads, high repetition. You need to recruit motor units of big motor units of muscle fibers to recruit those types 2BXs. And here's a concept that's easy to understand, but it's hard to trust. If you apply a load of 90 to 95%, which is the load you need to recruit those motor units, whether it's a velocity of 90 to 95%, or whether it's an actual weight of 90, 95% of one's ability, that load or that velocity is still submaximal. It's safe to apply. What's dangerous? Applying it too often. Okay, next slide. So we want to have very high contraction times. We want to generate great levels of force, and we need that by recruiting the type 2X muscle fibers that have the large diameter motor units. Let's talk about BFR. With BFR, you take someone through exhaustion, and I am a proponent of BFR, but the load is very light. You are not recruiting these big motor units or the largest motor units with BFR. Your neural pathway is not the same. There's a point in time you're going to have to get that athlete on their feet and apply more than a 30% max, 1 RM max load and not take them to exhaustion. BFR is part of the process. You need to load people so that you recruit motor units. You need to load your athlete so they get tendon adaptation, which is key to reactive strength qualities or your plyometrics. BFR does not do a lot for tendon. You need to get your athlete on their feet and load them. Next slide. And so why do we need to load them? Well, we know larger motor units are recruited and similar sized motor units are maintained greater fire rates with a high intensity contraction compared to moderate intensity contractions performed at fatigue, i.e. BFR, which is still valuable. I'm not bad-mouthing BFR, but it's part of the progression, right? To maximal activation of the motor unit pool, you have to use high intensity resistance training rather than moderate intensity to fatigue, right? An average percent increase on 1 repetition maximum strength is greater for high load in comparison to low load training. And there's also a study that shows athletes with a relative squat strength, meaning the amount of weight on the barbell compared to body weight, below the 2.2 and females below a relative ratio of 1.6 could be more susceptible to lower extremity injury over the season. You need to be strong. Next slide, please. So when we look at the hierarchy of athletic development, Vermeil's pyramid to the left is what he evaluates and tests just like we do in rehab. And then he establishes a work capacity. And what's the definition of work capacity? Work capacity is the ability of your athlete going through rehab or training to perform exercises repetitively over time without inducing excessive fatigue. Because when athletes get real tired, bad things happen, right? Less force production, neural pathways change, proprioception and kinesthetic sense changes, technique of exercise deteriorates, etc. So they need to be able to get the endurance, right, to produce repetitive exercises in their treatment session, in their weekly sessions, in their monthly sessions. And then they develop the physical qualities, which are different, right? Strength, explosive strength, elastic reactive strength, and then speed. We want to go from low velocity to high velocity. Optimally, when they return to play, they're at high velocity. And as I said, each physical qualities depend upon the optimal development of its predecessor. Now, we adapted this in rehab, right? Let's say we get an ACL patient. We evaluate, we test them. Well, we've got to establish mobility and movement, range of motion, get them off their crutches, etc. They've got to be able to have the range of motion to assume an exercise position to perform it properly, right? And then we need to get muscle re-education. We know muscles shut down, especially the quads, right? Arthrogenic inhibition. And so we need to get quads and other muscle groups firing again. So then we assume, when we have the range of motion, to assume an exercise position with proper technique, and the muscles are firing so that they're producing force during that exercise technique, then we could work on work capacity and then get into the hierarchy, work on strength exercises, explosive strength, elastic strength, and speed. Now, what's important to note is you can train all the physical quality categories simultaneously. The important part is where do you need to place the emphasis? And in rehab, it's going to be with strength, right? Because everything evolves from strength. Now, strength doesn't have to be a 500-pound squat, right? An unaccustomed stress to recruit that 2x motor unit could be a 1-pound weight on a straight leg raise when the athlete has only been 1 day post-op lifting the weight of their leg, all right? It has to be in an unaccustomed stress within 90% of their ability. Next slide, please. And so when you combine these things together, we look at, okay, Vermeil's hierarchy with the healing continuum. Well, in the first 4 weeks, let's just say ACL rehab, everybody seems to have an interest, everybody seems to do it, right? You're in the reaction and regeneration repair phase, and we're going to work on mobility, movement, re-education of the muscle, getting into work capacity and strength. The second 4 weeks is basically the same. That should really say 5 to 8, not 4 to 8, my apologies. And then finally, when you're in the remodeling stage, healed is healed, right? What are we afraid of? If we know the contraindications and we respect them, we could really start loading with the heavier weights and increase velocity of movement and start our return to sport preparation and add explosive strength and shift our focus to more explosive strength and elastic reactive strength abilities, because hopefully over the first 8 weeks, we've established a good strength foundation. Next slide, please. So even in our rehabilitation testing, we look at mobility, right? We look at their knee range of motion, let's say an ACL and their hip, et cetera. What do they have passively? But more importantly, what do they have actively? Because active range of motion is what's important to sprint, change direction, et cetera. And then we go through our testing, right? They do a strength test. If they pass our strength test, then we do an explosive strength test. You see the hierarchy here? And if they pass that, they do an elastic reactive strength test. If they pass that, we do a speed and change of direction test. And we're continually changing this. I've given you those articles for this reason. If they go through our spectrum and pass everything, then we decide, depending on their desires and how they present and the time of year, do they go back to return to training? Do you just go back to return to practice and prohibit them from competition? Or can they go back to competition at that time? During this process, let's say they fail their strength test. We give them a strength test. We give them a strength training program. They work on their strength training program for 4 to 6 weeks. They come back and we test. Because we know if they don't have good strength, they're probably not going to be good at anything else. If they pass their strength test, but fail their power test or their explosive strength test, then we give them that program and we stop the testing there. And they come back 4 to 6 weeks later and retest at that level, and so on down the line until they go through all physical qualities of the hierarchy, pass all physical qualities of the hierarchy, and then are able to either return to training, practice, or sport. Next slide. So that's, my Reader's Digest of our philosophy and how we look at things. So, if you want to take this off, if you want to have a discussion, if you have any questions, I'm happy to have the conversation. The biggest thing is we have found in our return to play is people are weak. We have 185 facilities. Not all our therapists are as talented as others. We have over 700 therapists in our company. And we do a lot of testing from outside physical therapy facilities, and especially in the females. And I'm not trying to be a chauvinist here, but especially the females, because maybe many of the high school females have not trained hard before getting injured. There's really a concern with the levels of strength that they have in return to play, especially their quad muscles. And I think that makes them susceptible either to lack the ability to return to play, to optimize their ability, what they were pre-injury, or set them up for a post-rehab injury. So you need to load them. They need to get strong, and then everything else will go through progression.
Rob, with that initial example of the combine testing and with, I think, collegiate, with kind of these normative values you have of kind of quartiles, when you have, maybe use that example of like a female youth athlete, what are you using normative values, or what are you defining as strong enough to progress to the next spectrum or continuum?
Two things: normative values and relative strength. Now listen, you have to get what we do, whether we're strength and conditioning coaches training athletes, or whether we're physical therapists rehabbing athletes, or anybody. We need to know the science, right? We need to make an educated decision to make the process, which is valid and proven, right? Evidence-based, that's what we call it, right? Because how do we know something works unless it's proven to work? But the other part of the equation of what we do is the art. How much, how often, when, etc., right? So let's say you want to work on lower extremity strength, all right? If you're working with a college athlete and they're going to be tested in the squat, then you're going to have to reestablish their ability to squat. But maybe they've never squatted before and you're limited in a time period, right? Because you're not going to get 1 million visits, rehab visits from the insurance company. And maybe they can't afford to pay you privately. And so maybe you want to go from the bottom up. Maybe you want to develop lower extremity strength by trap bar deadlifting or deadlifting, going from the bottom up versus squatting, which I call the barbell position from the top down, because it's not as technically difficult to perform if you've never done it before. So there's various ways you can strengthen, leg pressing, things like that. So you have to decide what it is you're going to do to enhance these physical qualities. Everybody's different. There's no right or wrong. Double leg, single leg, everybody has an opinion and everybody's justified in their opinion. But you have to decide as a professional how you want to go through this progression. It is highly unlikely that through the course of rehabilitation that your athlete is going to meet the standards of the game. But if you can restore full range of motion, like their active range of motion in sprinting, that's something that they don't have to spend time with when they train with their strength coach. If you can teach them to squat because they're going to squat in training, that's something the strength coach doesn't need to treat them. If you can establish a baseline level of strength so that they can progress from there, they'll be far ahead of the game. It's very unlikely that through the rehab process with you, they're going to meet the standards of the game because there's just not enough time based on the limitations of insurance companies and payers.
Rob, Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was talking with Q earlier this week, and we brought up a case scenario of an Olympic downhill skier.
Mhm.
And I think it was Matt Jordan's group that put it out. And granted, that's a very, very elite level.
Mhm.
And they, when they were testing, took their rate of force development metrics and their strength metrics and noted that they didn't reach back to prior level of injury
Mhm.
until almost 18 months after surgery. And so I was curious if at that elite level, if you've had a similar experience where because they already have a training history and we're already so strong, you've seen rate and strength have to take a lot longer time to come back.
There's a paper. It's in Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Physical Therapy. It's by a guy by the name of Angelosi. And the reason why I know this is because I always reference it. It's from 2012. And what Angelosi did was he's in Italy. He looked at soccer players and took their values before they were injured, right? Their physical quality values, and compared them, how long it took to get those values back post ACL. And he's found that with maximum voluntary isometric contraction, they were 97% at 6 months, but it took a year or more to get to 97, 100% rate of force production. And at 6 months, they were only about 60% rate of force production. And the reason is this, again, there's a number of factors. They have to apply force, right? They have to be strong enough to apply force. If you increase somebody's strength, you'll increase their speed, their vertical jump, etc. And then you want to keep progressing those improvements with training of a physical quality. So that's why strength's the foundation. Strength also gives you stiffness, right? We talk about the stretch shortening cycle of plyometrics. Well, you don't want that knee or that hip or that ankle to collapse like a folding chair. When you hit the ground, you've got to be stiff. And so that's strength as well. And so that's why strength is so important for a number of reasons. And without a good strength base, you're probably not going to be explosive. Now, there are some people who are genetically explosive, but if they're not strong, they're probably not going to last the season, right? Because they just can't take the pounding, practice after practice, competition after competition. And so, yes, so what we do is we've tried to figure out, so we'll talk about rate of force production. I could tell you what we do. So we've got to look at the continuum, right? So one of the things we start to do immediately is you've got to eliminate the fear of loading that limb, okay? Because kinesiophobia is a problem as well, right? Everything could be healed, muscles could be firing, but they're just afraid to load the limb. And so you've got to get rid of the weight shift when they start to do body weight squats. And we start body weight squatting immediately because they've got to sit in and out of a chair. And we relate a lot of things early in rehab to what they have to do in activities of daily living. So if they can sit in and out of a chair, why can't I body weight squat them? Why is it dangerous? And so we do what we call posting. If you put a 2, 3, 4-inch block underneath their non-surgical foot and try to teach them the body weight squat, they will have difficulty shifting away from the post-op limb because you've elevated the non-op limb, and they have to load that limb, all right? And then when they have a good squat pattern, let's say on a 4-inch block, depends on the person's height. The short person may have a 2-inch block. Then you go to 3 inches, 2 inches, 1 inch, and then they give you a good squat pattern on level ground. Now you can start loading them. Well, how do you want to load them? Bottom up, top down. That's the art, your call. We also start doing isometric mid-thigh pulls. Now we don't have force plates, but we start doing isometric mid-thigh pulls. Why? Because it's a test of strength and a test for rate of force production. So if it tests rate of force production, why can't I use it as an exercise? And what we do after they become familiar with the exercise is we load the barbell. So we put the barbell between 2 pins, and the barbell is lifted from the bottom pin to the top pin, which blocks them at the mid-thigh position. Why do I load the barbell? Because I know they have to produce enough force to exceed the weight of the barbell, that they're giving me at least that much of an effort. Then we'll progress them from mid-thigh pulls from boxes. If you think about the Olympic lifts, we do clean pulls. Why? Because it generates great amount of force production, and it's not technically difficult to teach. And we have bumper plates. So at the high bar position, they can release and let the barbell go back to hit the boxes. There's no danger to the limb. The other thing you could do to increase rate of force production is, and when appropriate, is jump up to the height of a box. You may start with a 12-inch box, and work your way up. Why? If I took a baseball and threw it 50 feet in the air, it would peak and then would come back down. And when I caught that baseball, it would hit me with the force that I produced to jump, because the baseball traveled the same distance. But if I caught the baseball at its peak, when it wasn't changing direction, at that instantaneous moment, when the baseball is not going up or down and changing direction, it's weightless. So if I jumped up to a box, and this will never happen, but at the point of landing, if that point of landing was the transition of neither going up or down, that landing would have zero impact, right? But my point is, when you jump up to a surface and land, it's less impact than jumping up and in place, because you've eliminated the velocity of descending back to the ground. They've peaked and then they landed on the box. They land at a lower velocity, lower impact, but jumping is an explosive exercise, right? So there are things you could do to lead up to plyometrics. There are things you could do to lead up. From pulls, we go into Olympic lifting. Why? We want eccentric rate of force production, which is important for deceleration and change of direction. So we go pull, 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 that's strong enough. Now we get more focused into Olympic lifting. And if you don't know Olympic lifting, that's okay. Then maybe just do pulls. You don't have to use barbells, you can use dumbbells. But we start catching it for two reasons. The eccentric phase, the bracing that occurs before you catch the barbell, which is bracing that athletes will do before they make contact with someone. And we know the catch is synonymous with landing mechanics, and it's a good lead up before you apply plyometrics or your elastic strength qualities. So, there are things you could do at low level. When you're emphasizing strength, right? You can do boxes, jumps up to boxes or pulls for explosive strength. You could do what's called ankling, which is very low level elastic abilities of your Achilles tendon, those types of things. The other thing we do early in rehab is, if you think about a crossover effect, if you guys know this already, if I have a right ACL reconstruction and I just left leg press with my left leg, well, my right leg is going to get stronger due to the crossover effect, right? We know that's proven. So if that's true, what if I exercise my whole body? Wouldn't I have a crossover effect then? And wouldn't my whole body benefit versus becoming deconditioned to the process? So if you want to unload the limb and do things like lat pull downs or bench pressing, that's fine. We like to do things in the standing position. So we'll do something called muscle cleans. We'll do overhead pressing. We'll do aspects that if they focus on the exercise, a couple things happen. They're not afraid to load the limb because they're focusing on exercise technique. They're improving their exercise technique when I'm going to use that more formally in their rehab or their training, if they stay with us to train. And I'm building strength, right, throughout the body. If you do exercises in a standing position, it's knee, hip, whatever, and we'll go back to the ACL, the knee. Compression gives you stability, and stability protects the ligament. So the standing position is a safe position to do exercises. You also know that when you do a knee extension from 90 degrees of knee flexion to 0 degrees of knee flexion, and that terminal 30 to 15 degrees, you have external rotation of the tibia, and you have the screw home mechanism, which is a locking of that joint. And that protects the joint, right? So if I externally rotate my feet in a standing position, 15 degrees, screw home is screw home. It doesn't matter if I'm fully extended or I got to full extension via 90 to 0 degrees of knee extension. So I have compression and I have a screw home locking mechanism, which I've mimicked, I'm sorry. And now I could do whatever I want with a standing locked knee, and I'll protect that ACL graft or that, meniscus or whatever it may be, or that hip or that ankle. So there are things you could do early in the rehab that's going to enhance the overall body conditioning, their work capacity, their strength levels, and touch upon other physical qualities, so that when you get to emphasize those physical qualities like power or anything else, they're prepared. They know the technique. Now it's a factor of load and velocity.
Rob, I have a question regarding, there's been a lot of chatter recently about, providing cognitive load during ACL rehab, that sort of thing. How do you see that fitting into Vermeil's hierarchy, and or do you see that more as something that happens as they grade back to sport and it just happens naturally by participating in non-contact drills, moving into, light contact in practice, et cetera?
Yeah, I think initially you can do that. All right. But no one's ever been able to tell me, and it may be out there. It's not like I've hunted for this extensively. And if any of you know this, please, teach me. As you go through a progression of velocity, how does cognitive exercises and technique change to correlate with velocity? Right? I don't know of anything. I mean, I know there are cognitive skills and things we do with exercises. Those are usually at low level activities, low level velocity activities. But as velocity increases, what's the change in cognitive skill? Does anybody know? Because I don't. And so I think, yes, there are certain cognitive things that we know, the evidence-based practice that we do at low level type things that will enhance those abilities. But I think good training will happen, as well as it will happen with that as well as you go through this velocity spectrum. Now, the same thing, I'll just stick my neck out here. I believe the same thing with energy systems. All right. I know that I have to focus on what my athlete has to do. This is kind of like, this statement's going to be hypocritical and contradictory, so bear with me. So I know, like, my athletes have to sprint and they have to do that. But as they do that, I'm developing the energy systems. I know that there are certain energy systems they need depending on their sport, but I think those energy systems evolve due to the training if it's appropriate. I don't focus on my energy system in my training. I focus on my training, which I know will correlate to the energy system. Does that make sense? And I look at it the same way with cognitive exercises or abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yes. With the cognition, I think it was I want to say 2018 maybe, that was looking at how dual tasking changed performance of like a single leg drop jump. I forget if it was a drop jump or a depth jump, but a single leg, and that significantly changed mechanics in people who were post-op ACL and had been returned to sport, cleared to return to sport. But again, that just makes me wonder, okay, they were cleared to return to sport, but how strong were they, right?
Okay, so here's a problem that's in our profession. When you step off a box, we'll say 2 feet, okay? When you step off a box and you land and you slightly bend the knees and dorsiflex the ankles and flex the hips and then jump into the air vertically, that's a depth jump. A drop jump is stepping off a box and landing straight-legged and coming off just with dorsiflexion, emphasizing the Achilles tendon. So people are saying drop jumps when they mean depth jumps. So no, there's a difference between the two. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'll ask is this, because I don't know this either. We're going with LSIs, right? Which is valid and documented in the literature. Does anybody know what the standard? See, I've given you the standard for sport, based on, and that's back to 2006. So what if it's a 500-pound squat in 2006? What is it now? And I really haven't looked into it because 500 pounds is enough probably. What's the standard for a single leg post-op ACL drop jump? I don't think anybody knows. I just compare one leg to the other, right? And so remember this also. Most loads, and I'm not knocking single leg work, it's appropriate, okay? We do it immediately post-op, right? We do a straight leg raise, that's single leg work. you're going to be able to produce more force, and you're going to be able to produce higher velocities, double leg versus single leg, because you got two legs working, right? Overall, when people cut, most times they jump cut. They don't just cut off one leg, all right? And the other thing is this, is that I look at single leg work and I do it, all right? I'm not saying I'm not knocking it, but don't forget, once you start sprinting and doing those, that's a lot of single leg work. Don't discount single leg work that occurs with running, sprinting, change of direction stuff. So, yeah, I mean, the problem I have with the cognitive stuff with the single leg is that, can they break it down to, is it a kinesiophobia problem? They're afraid to load the limb? I mean, we've had people that have had lower ground contact times, but less force production on a single leg depth jump because they just want to get off the leg. They're afraid to load it. So is it a kinesiophobia problem? Is it a strength problem where they don't have the joint and muscle stiffness, so they flex too much and they spend too much time on the ground? Or is it an elastic reactive problem where they don't have that ability yet because they haven't gone through the spectrum? All we know is that there's a deficit, right? If someone's slow in a 40-yard dash, is it their start? They're probably not going to hit top speed. Is it their ability to accelerate? Or are you just looking at the 40-yard dash time? What do you need to work on? So these are the questions I ask, and I haven't dug into it and called the experts from around the world to give me the answers. The answers may be there, but to just tell me that an RSI and we have a deficit of that RSI, I need to know what's responsible for that deficit. Fear, strength, elastic abilities. What do I need to work on? Because not always strength, but a lot of the times it is. So cognitively, yes, there are things we do in the beginning, right, to enhance that ability, but I throw it back out there. When your exercises and your athlete's training and your athlete's skill starts to enhance with velocity, what's the cognitive exercises that change to enhance cognitive skills at high velocity? And no one's ever been able to tell me that. So I think all this stuff, good training takes care of a lot of this.
Rob, over the past maybe decade or two, has there been anything that you used to do or used to think was more accurate that you don't do anymore? Or maybe to add on to that, your relationship with Al Vermeil, is there anything that you all highly disagree on?
No, because I think what happens is if all of us work together year after, and you'll find this when you have most people stay at their first job probably anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So you'll go in with your philosophy and your thoughts, right? And you'll learn from the peers in the clinic with you. And your nuances will be the fine tuning, but eventually it becomes like a melting pot, right? If you're with each other long enough, you'll take from them and they'll take from you, and you kind of start doing the same thing because as a group, you think it's the best way to approach it. The only thing I caution you with is that oftentimes there are statements made that this is the best way, that's the best way. Look at what's in front of you, right? It doesn't have to be A or B, right? People say, change of direction. What's more important, strength or the step position? Well, if you put a big engine in a car, wouldn't you adjust the brakes and the chassis and the shocks and everything so they could tolerate? Like, why does it always have to be one or the other? And the other thing I'll caution you on is this: when you do single leg work, right? Here's the advantages of bilateral leg work: load, velocity, and then if you get depth, you get hip mobility, right? Because you've got you have rotation factors and abduction and adduction. When you do single leg work, you're probably more in a straight plane. You don't have a lot of hip mobility with single leg work, all right? The other thing is, When you do, real elevated split squats or Bulgarian, whatever you want to call them, right? Everything has a price. If I back squat with a heavy load, I'm going to stress my lumbar spine, no doubt about it. And you can't keep, once you're at 75% your ability, like 75%, you can't keep neutral spine. There come loads where you can't keep neutral. It'll look like neutral spine, but you can't keep neutral spine. And so you'll load, right? So you'll say, okay, if someone has a really bad disc problem, I'm not going to do back squatting. But what if somebody has an SI joint problem? Do you really want to load them in a split leg position where SI joint problem is 30% of all low back pain? So you have to look at what's in front of you. Don't just take one exercise as gospel. Like I said before, we're going to train this athlete, or we're going to work with this athlete. Do I want to go from the top down or the bottom up? Do I want to use barbells? Do I want to use dumbbells? Do I want to use a trap bar? It all depends what's presented in front of you. Do I want to do single leg work? Do I want to do bilateral leg work? Everything, when you apply loads, there's always stress, and you have to be talented enough, the art of what we do, to say, this exercise is going to load these structures which either do or do not want. All right. And remember that there's no absolutes. There are absolutely no absolutes, or else we'd all be doing the same thing and everybody be getting better and everything would be 100% hunky-dory, right? We have a pretty low return to play rate after ACL reconstruction. So that hasn't changed for a long time. So we need to keep getting better. But look at it. Is it fear? Is it strength? What's the physical quality that's missing? Not just what's the distance they jumped, not just the time of their sprint. If I'm going to get them to jump further, jump higher, run faster, what's the component that's missing? Don't look at the forest. Also look at some of the trees. And remember, it's not just LSIs. They're important. They're your starting point. Well, what are the standards of the game? Because if your athlete doesn't meet the standards of the game, give them your business card. They'll be back.
So maybe I lost you, but I guess the bigger question was, is there any like big principles or big things that you have changed, or maybe?
No, not really. I think placing a greater emphasis on strength instead of when I was younger, trying to do all the fancy stuff. I just don't think you have the time. You might be able to get into power stuff, into introductory things. My philosophy, I do single leg work, but my philosophy is, if you think of the safety of the patient and the demonstrated abilities, 2 legs before one, right? Because you got a greater base of support, slow before fast, and linear before change of direction, versus trying to do too much too soon. More respect of the healing continuum, that even if somebody looks good, don't cross the line, because you may get consequences you didn't expect. Those types of things. I've stayed with the basics. The other thing is this, and the reason why, and again, because of my mentors in strength and conditioning, they've kept me pretty well grounded. The most powerful people in the world, arguably, are either Olympic weightlifters or track and field throwers, right? Discus shot, hammer throws. How do they train? And I look at how they train, and it's pretty much been the things that we've been using, for decades: squatting, Olympic lifting, pressing, those types of things. And if something was better, really better, why aren't they doing it? I just read something where great force production, everything, you should do single leg Olympic lifts. But if the United States weightlifting team isn't doing single leg Olympic lifts, it's not as valid to me as the person writing that article. Now, does it mean that you couldn't do them through a progression to get to bilateral leg, heavy single leg, heavy bilateral Olympic lifts? No, it doesn't mean you can't use them at all. But I just think that, like as I said before, you give me the exercise, I'll tell you what we used to call it. There's not a lot that's new out there. And so I've just tried to stay grounded. Surgical techniques have improved. That's the one thing I would say. If surgical techniques improve, speak to your physician. Does that allow you to become more aggressive? Do you still have to be as conservative with regards to your approach in rehab? When I first started, ladies and gentlemen, we used to cast our ACLs at 30 degrees for 6 weeks. So you can imagine what that would look like. All right. My rehab's a lot different now than it was back in 1984. So, you know, but basically the principles, Chris, now principles and things have stayed the same.
Cool. Your company that you co-own, it's giant. How do you create like quality control within the giant amount of clinicians you have?
It's tough. I'll tell you what we do, and it's tough, and it's real difficult, right? Because I'm going to have my bell-shaped curve with clinicians too, right? So what we've done is a number of things. I'll just throw out what we do. Reader's Digest again. We've developed our own educational curriculum that people go through. We have a residency program, which emphasizes your ability to sit for your OCS exam. We have a relationship with the university that if you want to do a fellowship after your residency in manual therapy, we can work on that with you. We have something we call Technique Peak, where every Monday morning at 6 a.m. and at 12 noon, because our people work 2 shifts, we have a 3-minute or less video on techniques that you can use to treat your patients. So that goes out. Every Tuesday night, we have a lecture series, whether it's somebody in our company, because we have over 150 advanced certified therapists, whether they're McKenzie, Maitland, we have OTs, whether they're CHTs, et cetera. So every Tuesday night, it's either a physician that gives us a lecture or one of our staff gives us a lecture. For either surgery or rehab, whatever it may be. And then what we try to do with our curriculum is we are doing it. So we look at our curriculum and then we do outcome scores. We've been doing outcomes for over 5 years. And we look at, let's say, Chris Hughes is having a problem with shoulder, right? So we have a mentorship program where we'll send someone to work with you for 12 weeks and hopefully emphasize shoulder. Right. And so you get better at shoulders. So we know individuals where they may be weak on their outcomes. And we'll say, Chris, these are the shoulder things that are coming up. We'll expect your attendance. Right. Then as a company, let's say 50% of all our therapists have a problem with shoulders. Then we've got to look back and say, maybe our curriculum's not that good on shoulders. How are we going to change it so our people get better? So we relate education with outcomes. And, then, like I said, we have a residency and the ability to help with the fellowship. And so those are the things. And then the side things, courses we give Tuesday night, we bring prior to the pandemic, we used to bring lecturers in, have one-day courses, weekend courses, whether it was spine, shoulder, anywhere from Kevin Wilk to whomever. And so those are the things we have a student conference every year. We take over 300 students from over 125 schools every year, and we have a one-day conference for students only to give them basics on what we feel is important in rehab. We do that every year. This year, we're doing that virtual. So we're very big on academia. We're very big on that, and those are some of the things we do. And we still have our problems, Chris. We still have our low 10% and the bell-shaped curve. So. We're trying.
Rob, you mentioned that LSIs, right, are the starting point in that, understanding both the standards of the game and actually even the position of the individual are keys as well, right?
Yeah.
Where in this current model where we have insurance being a limiter in where we're getting, how are you teaching or constructing your thought process for your clinicians of where do we need to focus? Because LSI may be where our time frame in insurance is. We may have just a little modeling of moving towards the standards of the game. So how are you framing that for them? Being aware of one end, but that's really oftentimes not where we get to go in the insurance model.
Agreed 100%. And that's why I said, so we take them through the hierarchy, right? So if someone comes out of surgery, you have to establish mobility and the muscle re-education, right? And if they can't do that, they don't have anything. Then they've got to establish strength levels, right? Now, we believe mobility trumps stability, because if I can't assume the position, then I'm going to have excessive stresses in that modified position. That's really not good, right? If I can't get my arm all the way overhead and I'm going to try to press a barbell overhead and I can only have 150 degrees of shoulder flexion, that barbell is not going to do, that barbell is going to have a negative effect on my shoulder, or I'm not going to be able to do that. So we've got to go through that process and then emphasize strength. Is it a shoulder? Where are we doing? Is it scapular strength, whatever it may be? Is it the leg? And it's got to be quad strength, because we know the deficits that occur after knee surgery with the quad, and get people on their feet to start to restore as best we can, force into the ground and reactive forces. So for instance, Paul, if you all want to look this up, there used to be a track and field coach by the name of Gerard Mach, M-A-C-H, and you could YouTube mock drills. And we use mock drills. There's an A, B, and a C series, and they're just segments of the sprinting process, all right? Biomechanics of sprinting. And we like to use the A series, all right? And the A series is, we'll do something. If someone could walk without crutches, Paul, and we want to know we're going to get them sprinting, once they get rid of their crutches, we know it's not going to look pretty, but we may start A marching or A walking. And then once they get that and we've healed enough and we've gotten stronger, then we may start skipping or A skipping, right? Things like that. So our emphasis is still on strength, but they're starting to put force into the ground and react to the ground. And, in between those, we're doing the pulls from blocks or isometric mid-thigh pulls, right? And so we're trying to go through that hierarchy where we have to place our emphasis immediate post-op. Mobility, right, the healing continuum, right? Get rid of pain, edema. I'm not ignoring that. I even mentioned that. I'm taking that for granted. But mobility and muscle re-education, okay, and now we could start, and then strengthening. And that's where it may end, Paul, based on the insurance company. And then we tell people, listen, we give you a discounted rate. We give you things to do at your gym, but you come in 1 or 2 days a week, and some people pay cash, some people can, especially with the pandemic, if they've lost their jobs. It's a very difficult situation, but that's why, we go through that hierarchy, mobility, re-education, work capacity and with strengthening, and it may end there, or if we're fortunate enough where it's a high school kid that's subsidized with their school insurance, we may be able to take them a lot further.
But and it's not necessarily a linear pathway though, right?
No, it's not.
We're co-working on this. This is just where our focus is primarily.
Correct.
Right? That's
absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're playing the hand that's dealt you, it's absolutely, it may not be linear at all, but we try to correlate, the hierarchy is a guideline. We try to correlate to the hierarchy. Like I'm being facetious here, right? If somebody can't squat, if they don't have good squatting form, and they can't have good squatting depth, and their muscles aren't firing, we're not going to put them in a squat rack with 400 pounds on a bar. I'm being facetious, but you get my point. Before they get to a loaded barbell, they've got to be able to demonstrate, as I said before, some tasks with proficiency. Then they've proven they're ready to do that. Well, what are those tasks, and what are the demonstrations, the task of proficiency you're going to use to go through this process of low velocity strengthening to high velocity performance, right? And it isn't linear, no. And that's the art, right? That's the art.
Right. The other part that I liked of what we were discussing or you're showing is the testing as far as pass fail. Know what the test is actually telling you or what potentials it is, and then go dig and find out why. And I would argue even why they passed, because we know athletes are great compensators, right? So Absolutely. They passed, but if it didn't look good qualitatively, just because they got a distance or whatever, what other things or why are we having those things? So we should be digging on the test no matter what, because that human in front of us matters as far as moving competencies and everything else.
Yeah, we have a relationship with a school called New York Institute of Technology. And so they've taken a couple of our people who have passed our return to play testing, as I outlined for you. And they've isokinetically tested them, and some have done real well, and some of them had real poor quads, as you stated, due to the compensatory abilities. And that's, like I said, that's the art. Remember this, if they don't look right, if it doesn't look right, it's probably not. All right, because my concern, and Paul, I don't know how you feel about this. My concern as a 40-year professional, and I'll sound like a parent, I apologize, is I think we're starting to place such emphasis on the academics, which is very important. I don't ignore that. I'm a very academically inclined person, but we're losing the art. Don't ever forget, what do you see with your eyes and what are you feeling with your hands? Because if it doesn't look right and it doesn't feel right, it's probably not. Because Paul's right. People are great. I had a guy, they're great at compensate. I had a kid years ago, all right? He came to me, he was an NBA power forward. He was about 6'10", 275. Played on a national championship college team. Went in the draft, was the first round draft pick his junior year. And he came to me because he had a knee problem, because he had a knee surgery when he was in high school that was never addressed. And I asked him, now this guy's already in the NBA for a few years. I asked him, let's look at your vertical jump. So he did a vertical jump. Then I wanted to look at his single leg vertical jump. Something didn't look right. So I asked him to jump up to a box, and he did it on 2 legs. Then I asked him to do it with 1 leg, and he wouldn't do it. I put a 4-inch box in front of him and said, just do a single leg jump off your surgical leg, which now at this time is like 10 years post-op, right? And he couldn't do it, or he wouldn't do it. He was afraid to jump up to a 4-inch box. And I said, how did you play all these years? He goes, I learned to compensate. And so he had to learn to reload that limb and whatever, and he spent the summer with us. And while he was with us, so it wasn't a credit to us, all right, he signed a $56 million contract. So it wasn't like he was with us and then he played and got the contract. He got a $56 million contract based on his performance off that bad leg, which he was able to compensate and hide. So, and then he played the next year, and he played all 82 games, and he did well, and hopefully we had something to do with that. But Paul's right. But remember, look for these things. Look for these nuances. If they're running or they're cutting, if it doesn't look right, it's probably not. And don't just look at the end result. Try to figure out, what are the components of this. If they sprint, can they get their heel to their butt? Do they have the active range of motion when they're running, or is there a deficit there? And you've got to get that to make sure their biomechanics of running is improved. Are their starts really good? Or maybe they need more strength qualities. Are their deceleration abilities good? Or maybe not. Maybe they need more eccentric rate of force development, which people don't talk about. Look at the components of their task, because that's what gives you the big picture. Don't just look at the total time. And that total time is important, or that vertical jump's important, right? Because that's the standard of the game, or the amount of weight they lift. That's the standard of the game. That's where they're going to be positioned in the draft. But if they're not doing well, you have to figure out what are the most important things you need to work on. That's the art.
Does anyone have? Oh, you got it.
Sorry. I think other people on the call will be able to articulate this a bit better, but I recently started working with ACL patients for the first time as a student. And so obviously we noticed that a lot of times people have that weight shift away from the leg early on. And it seems like posting is one of those things that can help with that. I'm wondering about some of the literature that talks about the intralimb compensations, where they'll have more of a, maybe like a glute dominant pattern, like to kind of shift away from the quads. Again, I think people will be able to articulate this better, but my question is, when I was reading the paper, I was wondering, oh, maybe can posting have some sort of, like it's teaching them these intralimb compensations early on that could have some sort of detrimental effect going forward? Or is that not the case? Again, I think more confused.
Well,
here.
then putting them on crutches would do the same thing. Right? I mean, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the good training, you have to go through a progression that, well, first, let's go back for a second. You got this ACL. Why do you think they have that glute hip dominance?
Lacking capacity of their, I mean, I guess the quad inhibition.
Right. So let me ask you something. If you strengthen their quad, what do you think would happen to that glute hip dominance?
You'll get more of that quad coming in.
Right. You probably, well, you probably get more quad coming in and less reliance on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, because the compensatory factor is being eliminated because there's no reason to compensate. If you load, there's no reason to compensate. If you have confidence in loading and confidence in absorbing reactive forces, then there's no need to compensate, right? And that's what I mean. I'm not telling you that everything's perfect. Like Paul said, it's not a linear progression. It's not all just, but I think if you go through a process and you start to restore the deficits that are there, a lot of this stuff will take care of itself. Some of it won't. Some of it will really require some good talent, like a multi-ligament knee or, those types of things. But a lot of the things you correct will eliminate the compensatory things that you're concerned about.
Rob, going off that, in y'all's clinic or throughout the clinics, how do y'all measure LSI?
We don't. So first of all, it's not like I have this. The best clinic I have a PT clinic, and I mean they're talented people. I'm talking about aesthetics. So we have a 20,000 square foot performance center with a PT clinic in it, right? It's our the toy store Schwartz in the city, right? It's like that's our thing. I don't have any isokinetic units. No one has asked me for an isokinetic test in over 2 decades. We have a KT 1000 knee ligament arthrometer. No one's asked me for that. The only time I get asked for a knee ligament arthrometer test if someone has metal in their knee and they can't get an MRI, which is maybe 2 a year, 3 a year. So, and the other thing is I can't afford 185 isokinetic units, right? Because if you have one, everybody else wants one. So what do we look at? We look at RSIs, we look at strength, and we try to correlate it to the tasks they're going to have to do in training. We have a jump mat, right? Which our facilities have jump mats. They're pretty economical, and we know we can get reactive times and jump heights off of jump mats. We have Vertex. We have electric timers. We look at timing in regards to sprinting, things like that. So those are the types of things we use. We don't have isokinetic units. I don't have force plates, etc. So can I give you? Let me ask you, and I'm going to be. I'll be the other side of the coin here, right? I'll be the con guy. Just because I don't measure it, it doesn't mean that if I have an athlete that runs a 4.340 and you're going to tell me that they don't have enough dorsiflexion on their left ankle, what do you want me to do if they're running 4.3? Are you going to change? I'm not talking about the arc of motion, but are you going to eliminate the external rotation in a thrower because it's excessive to their non-throwing arm? We're asymmetrical in life. People are right-handed or left-handed, most people, right? And it's that asymmetry that's reinforced every time they do the skill of their sport, right? Every time they throw or swing, if they're not a switch hitter, they're reinforcing that asymmetry because they're not doing anything on the other side. And it may be that asymmetry that gives them their success in sports. So be careful with correcting stuff, right? Because you may get a result you don't desire. Now, with that said, if a negative consequences is occurring because of that asymmetry, I've got to change that, right? And that's the art again. What do I change or what do I don't change? So now I look at force plates and my ACL limb it has a big deficit on an LSI. For whatever, you've got to tell me what it is and how that corresponds to their return to play. So I'll give you an example. One argument for doing single leg work is the bilateral deficit, right? Everybody's familiar with the bilateral deficit? If I leg press my right leg and I leg press my left leg and I add that total together, it'll be more than what I could leg press with both legs. Okay. Two things are true about the bilateral deficit in strength. One is it's a factor of training. Rowers, right, don't have bilateral deficits because they're pushing off two legs in the boat. Cyclists have bilateral deficits because they're single leg pushing when they cycle. Well, have somebody jump off their right leg vertically, measure it. Have somebody jump off their left leg vertically, measure it, and then have them jump vertically off both legs and find out where the bilateral deficit is with power. Usually the bilateral deficit with power will be off the single leg, where they may say bilateral deficit in strength is contributed. It depends on what you want to do. That's what I'm saying. Don't take everything as gospel or as absolute. There are no absolutes. So now I go back to your question. What am I doing? LSIs give me a baseline, right? If I need somebody to squat 500 pounds and their deconditioned non-op leg is still 50% better than their post-op leg, I'm not worried about them squatting 500 pounds. This leg is in really bad shape, right? And so if I get an LSI of 100 and that's still a big deficit, okay, now I know both legs are equal and I've got a deconditioned athlete that I can continue to progress to get to the standards of sport. So, you know, I know I'm jumping around a little bit here. That's just how right or wrong, that's how I look at it. And as Paul has pointed out, I've had people pass or return to play that still had not the quad we would have wanted based on isokinetic testing. And then someone will argue, okay, I got this bad quad. The guy runs a 4.3 and you don't play sports sitting down. What do you want me to do? Well, you know, I still want to increase that quad strength. I have to, because that's going to be viable over the course of a season. I don't know if that makes sense. That's just how I look at it. So we want absolutes, right? We want absolute measurements, but that's not always the case. What do you see? What do you feel? What's their performance?
And even most performance measures are just that. How good are they at these measures? Because there's people that rock all these measures and in their sport really aren't that great.
They're not great. Listen, I've had 500-pound squatters that sat the bench, right? I mean, you know, listen, remember this too. And I'll get rocks thrown at me when I say this, especially if I'm at a conference, okay? There's a difference between athleticism and skill. And in my opinion, nothing we do in rehab is sport specific. Okay, so let's go back to our ACL athlete, okay? We enhance their vertical jump, okay? We go through these physical qualities, we go through Vermeil hierarchy, and we give them a personal best on their vertical jump, a physical quality of explosive strength, right? And it's a basketball player. What did we do for their shooting percentage? Did we make them a better shooter? That's the skill. Unless you're a shooting coach, you didn't do anything for their skill. You enhanced their athleticism. Your Tommy John surgery pitcher, you got them to throw 90 miles an hour again, but they got a crappy ball strike ratio. What did you do for their ball strike ratio? Nothing. That's the skill. You enhance their athleticism to throw at high velocity. Same thing with bat speed. If you increase someone's bat speed because you went through the hierarchy and increased their strength and explosive and their elastic abilities, did you make them a 300 hitter? That's the skill. So unless you're a hitting coach, we didn't do anything for their skill. We enhance athleticism in rehab. We enhance the physical qualities necessary to play the game. And we hope, because we have one nervous system, we don't have a nervous system for golf and a nervous system for soccer and a nervous system for tennis. We have one neuromuscular system, and we hope that through the repetitive practice of the game, and the competition of game day, that those physical qualities transfer to enhance their skill level by the repetitive practice of their skill. We don't do anything sport specific in the clinic.
Rob, to that point, you'd said a few minutes ago, you don't play the sport sitting down. I think that was alluding to like knee extensions or,
Mhm.
so that kind of, I feel like contradicts what you said about, nothing what we do in training is sport specific. So why would it matter for doing, let's say like a single leg exercise or a machine or a knee extension? It's
Because
all
I have to determine the deficit that's prohibiting me from advancing that physical quality. So maybe you want to use knee extensions to enhance quad strength. You want to isolate that quad so that when I have you on your feet and you're in the deep knee bend position of squatting that requires quad muscle activity, especially during a front squat, which is imperative to the catch when my guys are Olympic lifting or girls are Olympic lifting, that I don't have a quad deficit and they're going to come out of the hole the way that I want them to and reduce my risk of injury. So if I have so my strength coming out of the blocks, do I have a glute deficit? And what is my adjunct to strengthen the glute through bilateral or single leg, however I want to do it, so I get a better push against the blocks, so I have better start times. Because if you want to decrease your 40 is going to decrease from the start and the first 10 yards more than it is from yards 10 to 40. And what is the prohibiting factor in that component of the 40? What is the prohibiting factor of me getting deep in my squat? Because I've got such a weak quad, they don't trust it. What is the prohibiting factor that they're still going to weight shift and not load that limb? Is it the quad? What is the prohibiting factor that's not allowing them to succeed in the task I want them to do? And once I identify that, how am I going to enhance that prohibiting factor so it's no longer a detriment and they can perform that task confidently, right? And that's your choice. If you want to do, Chris, whether it's knee extension, whether it's single leg work, whatever it is, that's your choice. That's what I'm saying. There are no absolutes. It's what you're most comfortable with based on the scientific evidence that assures you're either testing what you're testing or strengthening what you're strengthening or whatever it may be. That's why we need evidence-based and not just pull something because we did it when we were younger or our coaches told us to do it or our senior therapist told us to do it. But don't forget the art. So if it's a quad problem, how are you going to eliminate that problem? That's your choice, however you want to do it. Don't just look at the result of the test. That's important because that's going to give you the standard of, there's 6 million ACLs and they're supposed to do this. Okay, he can or she can't do this. That's important to know. But why? Why can't they do that? And then they're discharged from therapy and they're going to train. Why can't they meet the standard of the game, whether it's strength, power, or velocity? Why? I know the end result, that's important, but why can't they get to the end result? That's an art that I think we're losing in our profession. I do. And I hope I'm wrong. But, we want the absolute test result. We want, sometimes deficits are important, sometimes they're normal. Because people are asymmetric. They have asymmetry. They're either right or left-handed. Right? In a baseball game, the pitcher doesn't pitch righty to left-handed hitters and then put on a different glove and pitch lefty to right-handed hitters. They pitch whatever dominant arm they are that whole game, regardless of who's up.
Does anyone have any last minute questions before we wrap it up?
Listen, I thank you all for spending time. I thank you for having me, and you know, I hope some of this makes sense to you. It's just maybe it's just a different way to think about it. I've been burnt. You'll get burnt. Don't worry about it. You know, just you're gonna make your mistakes. Just try to learn from them and don't make the same mistake twice. You'll be fine. If you're not sure, don't do it. And I'll leave you with this. Don't forget what you see, and don't forget what you feel, because that's the art. That's what's going to make you better than your other peers. It's not only about the numbers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great.
All right, if you ever want anything else again, just let me know.
Yeah.
Happy
Yeah.
to do it.
Enjoy your Easter, and everyone else, thanks for joining the party.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Paul, I'm sure we'll speak. You take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.